Welcome to the new season of the Live Your Spa Life show. The SPA in Spa Life stands for Seek Power Always, that divine power within you to do what you're here to do. The theme for this season is intentional living. Amazing people like you share ways to live by design and with purpose to ensure that this short ride of life occurs with choice, physically, financially, spiritually, and in your relationships to create a world-class life. In these times of uncertainty, it's time for you to move past the distractions and start trusting yourself more through your God-giving knowingness. No one truly knows better what's best for you than you. In this season, you'll have plenty of examples of people choosing their best life and creating a positive impact through intentional living. Thank you for sharing your precious time with us and being part of the Live Your Spa Life conversation. With us today is Andrea Sampson, who is a master storyteller and CEO of Talk Boutique. Andrea leverages her extensive background in marketing, advertising, and public speaking to help clients craft engaging stories and deliver impactful talks. As a TEDx-trained coach and key figure in bringing Singularity University to Canada, Andrea specializes in making technical and scientific content accessible while maintaining its credibility. Her unique expertise and passion for transforming the world of public speaking has positioned her as a sought-after executive coach and a leader for speakers worldwide. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Diane. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I would love to jump in with what led you into wanting to be a thought leader.
Well, I don't know that I ever had that as a conscious thought. I spent most of my career working in advertising, and about 10 years ago, had the very good fortune to be volunteered as a TEDx speakers coach. And at the time, I didn't even know what a speakers coach was, but my background in branding and advertising meant that I presented all the time. And so I embarked on this journey, and it took me all the way to starting my business. And as I began Talk Boutique about, I guess, 7, 8 years ago now, what happened for me was I started working with some of the smartest people I had ever met, quite frankly, and, noticed something about them. And that was that they were so busy doing the work that they do, the good work in the world, that they weren't telling anyone about it. And so most of us didn't have any idea of the incredible things that were already happening in our world, making our future actually, quite frankly, a better place to be. And we kind of needed them to. And so what I realized was that here were what I knew to be thought leaders, but yet they were living in the world of expert, and experts often are unattainable, right? They use language that you and I just simply don't understand. It's often based in science or math or whatever discipline they happen to be in. But a thought leader helps us understand things. They tell us stories. They bring us into ideas. And so I started building this practice around creating thought leaders. And in doing so, I suddenly found myself becoming one, to my own surprise.
I love that. And so how is it that you're so passionate about having diversity among our thought leaders?
Yeah, great question. So as I was working with so many of these incredible thought leaders, and as I said, they didn't see themselves that way. They saw themselves as experts. And many of them, well, they didn't look like what many of us would think a thought leader looks like. When we think about thought leaders, who do we think of? We think of leaders of countries, leaders of companies, leaders of industry, leaders of, government. And when we look around at all of those leaders, the reality is they look very different than you and I, Diane. They tend to be a lot of men and a lot of similar colors of men. And that unfortunately means that they're making the decisions on the future that we're creating, because that's what our thought leaders do. They create our future. And so when I started working with all of these experts who I knew could be and should be thought leaders, I started to realize part of the reason they weren't seeing themselves as thought leaders is because they weren't seeing themselves reflected in thought leaders. And I know that no matter where you look in the world, in any sort of scientific reasoning, it will tell you that diversity brings a better product. So when we have diversity of gut bacteria, as an example, we digest our food better. When we have a diversity of plant life, we have a better ecosystem. Well, the same is true of humans and thinking. When we have more diversity of thought leaders, we are bringing in a better quality of thought. And more importantly, what we're doing is we're creating a future that reflects all of who are being served by it, not just the few who actually created it. And so diversity of thought leadership is absolutely essential. It's diversity of the thinking itself, but equally as important is the diversity of those who are thinking those thoughts. And so the more diversity, and that's not just cultural diversity, although that's part of it. It's cultural diversity, it's gender diversity, it's neurodiversity, it's age diversity. We need diversity in its broadest sense, forming how we are creating our future by the thought leaders who are doing that.
Mm-hmm. So how are you helping distinguish between what people are maybe, self-selecting as experts and being a thought leader? Like, what are some of the distinctions that you're making?
Well, the biggest issue, is that when we think about experts and even what I call change makers, it really comes down to, I've created a little model, and it's think of it as a tension model at 4 quadrants. And on one axis, we have the concept of influence or emotional impact. What kind of an emotional influence or impact are you having with those you are communicating with? And then the other axis is your confidence in the expertise or skill or knowledge that you're bringing. And I'll sort of step back and go, first of all, as experts or change makers or thought leaders, our number one job is to be professional communicators. That's what we do. We communicate really, really well. Well, when you're communicating, really those two things, the two questions that we need to ask ourselves are, what sort of influence are we bringing, the emotional connection to our audience? And what is the confidence in the skills or knowledge that we're bringing? And when we look at that on a 4 quadrant system, what you have are really, so if we look at the somebody who is highly confident in their knowledge, but not really focused on creating an emotional connection or influence with their audience, that tends to be an expert, right? They stand away from their audience. They tend to live in the place of data and facts, and they don't want to go into that place of emotions because they feel that it will in some way denigrate the information they're giving, that it'll make it less important or less true. On the other side, we've got those who lean heavily into that emotional influence, heavily into the area of creating an emotional connection with their audience. Now, they may have the same knowledge as the expert, but they're choosing to be more influential, more emotional. I call those change makers. What they're doing is they're connecting with their audience, but they don't want to go too deep into their knowledge because the fear is, well, if I go deep, I'll lose you. So I'm going to keep you on that emotional connection. Then we've got in the middle what I call the connectors, and the connectors are often have a lot of imposter syndrome, and they pass along. They don't feel they have the experience or the influence. Now, again, none of this is actually true. These are all mindsets that we bring. So the thought leader mindset is where you're combining that emotional connection and influence with the expertise and knowledge that you bring in a way that connects with the audience. You're showing up not from a place of, I know everything and I'm not going to connect with you, or from the place of, I'm knowledgeable, but I'm so passionate about this, buy what I'm selling you, or learn what I'm telling you because of my passion. What we're doing as thought leaders is we're showing up with a seamless blending of that, where we're showing up accessible to our audience, emotionally available to our audience, fully confident in our knowledge, but open to having conversations in a way that extends and expands that knowledge. And that's really the biggest difference between an expert, a change maker, and a thought leader.
Got it. I love those distinctions. And, we further hear people who identify as public speakers. So how does that come into the equation?
Well, now a public speaker, and I work with a lot of public speakers, they live in all three of those categories and even all four of those categories. Some public speakers are absolutely thought leaders. They are so comfortable in that place of accessibility and knowledge. Many live in the place of expert. And we all know those public speakers because we know we're going to a lecture. We're not going to a talk. And or we know those speakers who are highly passionate. We love them. They get up on stage and there's lots of animation and lots of information coming our way. But often after the talk, we think, what did I really learn? Did I take anything away from it? So a public speaker is just where you actually, it's the function of speaking. Whereas the way in which the audience perceives you, and how you perceive yourself, and this is part of it, is whether or not you're showing up as that expert, that change maker, that thought leader, or what I call the connector. And connectors often don't show up at all because, again, they have so much imposter syndrome. They tend to pass off those opportunities saying, oh, Diane has so much more experience or knowledge than me. She should do that. So they're not usually showing up on the stage, or if they do, they're so self-conscious about themselves that we as the audience, want to embrace them and say, it's okay. It's okay. Just tell us what you have to say. But usually we're seeing the change makers and the experts, and from time to time, the thought leaders. But the reality is thought leaders are the ones that are the least represented because few people actually know the importance of being that thought leader. Because in our world, expertise or passion are often what are encouraged, and it's not the seamless combining of the two that most people see as being something that's possible.
Yeah, it's so important, the, excuse me, the like imposter syndrome of where people thinking that other people know more than they do. And so one of the things that, I'm always reminding people about is that your personal experience is unique to you, which makes you that expert in that area, in how you experience something and how you're able to convey that. And I love how you bring story into that as well, because then people can be, really relatable to that. When it comes to thought leadership, is that a learned skill?
So yes, and I'm going to go back to what you said because I couldn't agree more. So your unique experience is what makes you a thought leader in that thing, and this is where I think we look at thought leadership as something that's outside of us, something that's somebody, a title that somebody has to come along and go, oh, now you're a thought leader. That's not it at all. It's a way of showing up in the world. No one's going to put a TL behind your name, so don't worry about that. So, how do you become a thought leader? Is it a learned skill? Yes, it absolutely is. But actually, more importantly, it's a mindset. It's a mindset that we show up with. We show up knowing that we're of value, knowing that our experiences are everything we need to be able to be the thought leader in the area that we are a thought leader in. So your story, your life experience, your knowledge, your skill set, the training, the expertise that you have gained throughout your life, that's what makes you a thought leader in that area. And there's no competition here. Think about TED Talks. When we think of any topic, there's probably 10, 20, 100 TED Talks on that same topic. And we could watch every one of those TED Talks and we would still learn something from every one of them. Why? Because we're learning from the speaker, the person, the thought leader who's actually conveying that. And we're learning it through the lens of their knowledge and their experience. And so they're showing up as a thought leader in that area. And we learn something. And more importantly, we learned something that we couldn't have learned from anyone else because their experience gave us the context that allowed us to see it in a new way. So is it a learned experience? Yes, it is. It's the learning of how to blend your story, your knowledge, and your why, your reason for being into a statement that becomes the basis for all of your thought leadership.
So good. Speaking of, kind of what people bring to the table, with all of your experience with TEDx in order, coaching people and being behind the scenes in that, what are some of the things that you've noticed in that process that you now bring to your work today?
Well, everything I bring to my work comes from that. I've developed an entire process around helping people to define their core thought leadership. And it is a process. I work with them in a couple of different ways. So the first thing I learned, I think, working on TEDx's was the importance of an idea. And my background, as I said earlier, was in advertising. And I spent sort of the latter part of my career in advertising as a brand strategist, and what that meant was I did a lot of research and a lot of primary and secondary research, which would require then that I take all vast amounts of information and distill it down into what we would call in the industry a core insight, a core consumer insight. Now, that would mean that I would have to go from reams and reams of data into usually one or two sentences. And I learned how to do that pretty good. And those sentences, those core insights, were what the expression that you see in the marketplace was built off of. So it would be a statement that I would then take to our creative teams, and they would build the creative on top of that. Well, when I started working with TED speakers, what was so interesting was I was working again with some of these smartest people I had ever met. And, they had full life experience. I'll never forget working with one of the first speakers that I worked with. He had a dual PhD in engineering and in medicine. And he walked into our very first session, and he opened his notebook to take some notes. And I sort of glanced over and noticed that everything in it was math. And all I could think was, oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to communicate with this person, and as we started speaking, now this person was working on decoding the human genome. He was working on a worldwide project to do that. And we were doing a TED talk on what is, how do we read our DNA statement, our genome? That's just a small topic. And he had 6 minutes to do it in. And we had to find a way to explain to people how to decode the genome in 6 minutes. And in speaking with him, I started to understand that this skill that I had developed in advertising of taking vast amounts of data and distilling it down was the exact thing that I needed to be able to work with TED speakers. So distilling everything down to one idea is really key. And so that's one of the first things that I took into the business that I have now. We call that statement now a statement of purpose, or the core idea. Those two things are sort of interchangeable, but they are the main thing. What they are is the foundation of any communication you're going to make. That could be a 6-minute talk, an hour-long lecture, a 5-minute presentation, a text, an email, an article. It doesn't matter what the communication is. What is the core idea that lives inside of it? And as a thought leader, you have one core idea. You may have 1,000 expressions of that idea, but you've got one core idea. And it's important because that's what you stand for. So number one, what's your idea? Number two, the second thing I learned is that in order to be that expert communicator that I talked about, you have to have that idea, you have to align to it. But equally as important is you also have to have a personal brand, a brand that aligns to that idea and also authentically aligns to your core values. What makes you, you? And why do those things make you, you? So an idea that you communicate, a personal brand that supports that idea and authentically connects with who you are. And then the third thing is a community of people who follow you and support and amplify your message and your brand. Those three things are the things that I learned coming out of the TED world and working with thought leaders worldwide are what's needed. And that's exactly what I work with my clients on now and help others to understand how to do.
Yeah. What's so powerful about that is a lot of times people can be really scattered as far as knowing like what their one thing is. But when you really incorporate that, when everything else that you stand for, that you do is actually in support of that, I think it actually becomes easier to really distill that. Like, what is that common thread in your life of what that looks like? I mean, I know for me, I can say, I talk a lot with Spa Life, seek power always, that power within you, right? Well, that
Right.
power within you were things I used, whether or not when I was a police officer, when I was consulting, when I'm training. Those are some of the threads where if you take them individually, it's like, how do those things relate? Like, what do they look at? So I love how you really point out for people to look at what's that one thing, and it matches your personal values, what you represent, and then you can get behind that as your message and build your brand and seeing what that is. Keeping that in mind, a lot of people, especially as the expert title, are, really confident about what that is for themselves, but the idea of leaping onto a stage and then sharing that with others, that's where a lot of the fears come up. And you talk a lot about the mindset as well. How do you help people deal with that fear of just, what is it? Public speaking is what the number one or two thing that people are
Yeah.
most afraid of aside from death.
Yeah, that's it. It's actually, they're more afraid of public speaking than death. There's actually been studies done on it.
Yes.
And it's crazy. I mean, why are people so afraid of public speaking? I mean, having worked with so many speakers, the thing that I most commonly encounter of that fear is that it's the fear of being found out. It is that we all, I mean, and especially women, but I think everybody to some degree has imposter syndrome. Now, some have it worse than others, but we all have that little bit of a fear of, what if I get up there on stage and I forget what I'm going to say? Or what if I don't really know what I think I know? Or what if somebody asks me a question that I can't answer? I mean, so we have all of these conflicting thoughts going through our mind. And then, of course, what happens with those conflicting thoughts is our body gets involved. And we've got neurochemistry that works against us and starts hitting, we walk onto stage and we get hit with adrenaline, a big hit of adrenaline. And that adrenaline puts us into a fight, flight, or freeze response. And if we are not ready for that, it can be absolutely debilitating. And so, when I'm working with speakers and especially those who are nervous to get up, the first thing we do is we look at, why are you nervous? What is it about speaking that is holding you back? And there are a couple of things that happen. And, as a speakers coach, and actually I am neurodiverse, which means that I actually, my brain works a little different than most people. I have an executive functioning disorder that means that I actually have to notice things a lot more openly. And so what I do is I've become, we all have these coping mechanisms. I've become a keen observer of people, and I can see in people when they are not being congruent with how they feel and what they say. And so what happens in talking to somebody, especially when they're nervous, is I start to see that they're actually saying things they don't believe. And so it's really interesting, because this is where this expert and changemaker title comes up so often. They think they have to be, let's say, the expert. And so there's a part of them that doesn't believe they're the expert, because we all have those parts of ourselves. And so when the thought of getting up on stage, that part of themselves and the part that doesn't believe it, they go to war with each other inside of ourselves, right? And so then they write a talk that is an expert talk, and it's got facts and figures, and they got to remember all of these really big things. And then, of course, now their brain is in overload of, oh my God, how am I going to remember all this and be the expert? And what if somebody says I'm wrong? And then there's that little part of themselves that's saying, and you're not really the expert, you're an imposter. And all of that, of course, is tearing down everything. Yeah, it's just like, oh my God. And so what I do with them is I help them to decode that. And I'll see it. I remember working with one particular speaker, and every time she went to say a certain word, she would choke on it. She would it would literally, she couldn't get it out of her mouth. And, she would say, oh, that's a hard word. Can we change it? And I started to notice no matter what we changed the word to, she couldn't get it out of her mouth. And I said to her, okay, what you're saying right now, what about it don't you believe? And she looked at me and she was like, well, no, I believe what I'm saying. And I said, well, I don't believe you because I'm in the audience. And what I'm seeing is I don't believe what you're saying. So tell me what it is that you don't believe. And we started, and as soon as we did that, something came up, a memory of a childhood memory that sparked something very deep inside of her that she'd been holding on to. And suddenly, all we really needed to do, because it had nothing to do with what she was saying. What she was saying, she actually did believe it, but she wasn't believing it because of some early conditioning. And so simply in that moment, her body was rebelling against the early conditioning. All we needed to do was to go back and go, well, is that true? No, it's not true. She knew that. We had to surface it. And this is part of the limiting beliefs process. When you have these limiting beliefs, and we don't even know we have them, they live so deeply inside of us that they stop us from doing things like getting on a stage and showing our brilliance. And so in that coaching process, that's part of what I need to do. And I can notice it on somebody in the moment when they're struggling and pull it out. We surface it. We look at it. We ask, is it true? Is it helpful? Is the next question. Because even if it's true, we can go, but is it helpful?
Right.
No, it's not helpful. Okay, then why do we need to bring it up now? Is there a way for us to reframe whatever it is you're saying in a way that's still true and helpful?
Right.
And so we find the different way of saying it. So, helping people to get through those blocks is such a big part of it. It only takes a few moments, but it's in the process of public speaking, especially because it's so confronting to everything that we believe about ourselves. I often talk about the concept of, how, when we think about ourselves, we have a perception of ourselves. And that perception we think of as one thing, but it's actually two things because it's how I perceive me, but it's also how I perceive that you perceive me. Mm-hmm. Those two things are 100% in my control. And because they're in my control, I can choose how I show up to make sure that how I perceive me and how I perceive that you perceive me are congruent. And when I do that, I'm actually controlling how you perceive me because I'm showing up in the way that's congruent with who I want to be perceived as. And so this is part of that reframing process. Mm-hmm. So pulling apart those perceptions and then showing up congruent with them.
Right. Well, what's so wonderful about just us being these multiple-dimensional beings, right? There's so much feedback that we get, looking at how our body gives us feedback. There's mental, emotional, spiritual. There's so many different ways that we get to see the full package of who we are and how that actually lands in a congruent way for our audience and who we're speaking through. And what's great about having people like you as a reflective person when people are stepping into that space is to help them get into that alignment so they can be, having those things together when they're giving their message, both internally and externally, so that it has greater impact. So one of the things that I always love looking at is because I love how you talk about being able that we're at choice, right? We have 100% responsibility. We get to choose how we show up. And so one of the things I always like to ask is that we react and live differently in different parts of our home, whether it's our bedroom, our kitchen, our living room. So what is your favorite room in your home and why?
Well, I live in a condo, so it's not huge, but I actually love my living room. And I love my living room because it's my creative space. So I took up crocheting during the pandemic as my pandemic hobby. And it's become a bit of an obsession, quite frankly. And so I love being able to sit in my comfy couch and put on my favorite show and crochet away and feel like I am contributing, because when I'm crocheting, there's a couple of things that are going on for me. One is I'm being creative, which I love to be creative. But also I'm with my own thoughts, even though there might be some noise in the background with the TV or whatever. Often I'm thinking my own thoughts, and the process of using my hands and using my brain at the same time helps me to really work through things. It also helps me to feel very safe. And I think that that's a big part of the crocheting process as well, is that there is a feeling of feeling free and safe with it. So my living room is my little cozy nest where I get to be just me.
I love that so much. I think that sometimes I think people overlook the importance of like hobbies, right? And how they're used, because sometimes like, oh, that's a waste of time or whatever. But when you really look at how it brings joy to yourself, that you get to create something. For me, I love doing puzzles, like jigsaw puzzles. I mean, my whole family has done them together. It's one of the things that we do together. And I also have one at home where I'll listen to maybe an audiobook, or just that whole, when you're doing something with your hands, you work out things in your brain.
Yes.
You solve things, you give some peace to yourself. So I love that reminder for people of like, what are they doing in their space that really just revives their soul and allows them to just enjoy those moments. So I think it's so wonderful. And I know that our listeners are going to want to stay in contact with you. How can they best do that?
So follow me on LinkedIn. I'm very, very active on LinkedIn. So make sure you follow me there, Andrea Sampson. I think it's, I'm sure you'll put the URL in the show notes. And they can also follow me, or they can sign up for our newsletter at talkboutique.com. And they can also watch for my upcoming book. I have a book coming out next year called The Everyday Thought Leader. And so just watch for that. And of course, we also have the Thought Leader Academy if anyone is interested in learning more about that.
Wonderful. I love that. And as you know, our theme for this season is inspired living. So in what way are you living an inspired life today?
Well, I just got back from Spain. So I last night. And so my inspired life is really, I was on a beach in San Sebastian on Friday, realizing that I need to do more of that, to just sort of spend some time with no devices and just looking at the beauty of life and the life around me. There was a young father with his daughter beside me at the beach, and I just kept thinking, how beautiful is that to see a family together, just a father and daughter, and enjoying. And so I was very inspired by that and just enjoying the beauty of life. And so that for me was a big reminder that I need to slow down, spend some time just being, and the inspiration comes when we're in that space.
Oh, so good. I love that so much. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing your wisdom and being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Diane. I have so enjoyed this.
Oh, wonderful. And to our listeners out there, I hope this gave you a breath of fresh air. This is going to be landing in the middle of summer. And, what inspiring action are you taking? What kind of things are you doing, in your life to have intention and impact? We want to have that balance of, being on vacation, like in Spain, which ironically, I'm going to be there in 2 weeks, and being able to really find out, what is that one thing that inspires you? What is your thought? What is it that you stand for? And how can you rally everything else around you to be in alignment with that purpose? If you have any questions with that, please reach out to me or Andrea. We'd be happy to support you. And until we connect again, live your spa life. Bye for now. Bye-bye.